Kara had never been one for casual encounters, but after the breakup, she'd needed to feel something, anything. When she met Luke at the bar, something in his dark eyes and confident smile drew her in. He was charming, just the right amount of mysterious. After a few drinks and some laughter, they left together, walking down the quiet, dimly lit streets toward her apartment. The night was warm for November, and the city was quieter than usual, the only sound the soft echo of their footsteps. At her place, the mood shifted quickly, passion building as the door clicked shut behind them. But when the night came to an end, Kara felt a twinge of unease. Luke had been different. He'd moved with a kind of intensity she hadn't expected, his touch almost too firm, his gaze too unwavering. But it was over now, and the silence between them was thick, like a wall that couldn't be breached. "Good night," she said, standing awkwardly by the door. Luke didn't reply. Instead, he simply looked at her, his eyes dark, almost hollow. "Are you sure?" he asked, voice low. Kara froze. Something about his tone, the way he said it, unsettled her. "Yeah, I'm sure. Thanks for the night." He nodded, but his gaze lingered, and as he stepped past her to the door, she thought she heard him whisper something, though she couldn't make it out. She shrugged it off, chalking it up to nerves. The next morning, she awoke to an empty bed, the sheets still warm where Luke had been. She sat up, the strange feeling from the night before creeping back. It was early, the sunlight weak through the blinds. Kara stretched and reached for her phone, checking her messages. There was a single text from Luke. "You shouldn't have let me leave." She frowned. It didn't make sense. Had she missed a call or another text? She searched her phone for any sign of what had happened during the night, but it was all a blur of fleeting moments. The uneasy feeling settled deeper in her chest. But it was just a one-night stand, right? That's all it was. She let the thought linger for a moment before shaking it away. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the skyline, she decided to go for a walk to clear her head. Her apartment was small, and the streets outside were busy, filled with people going about their lives. As she passed by a quiet alley, she stopped. There, standing at the entrance of the alley, was Luke. His eyes locked onto hers, his expression unreadable, like he'd been waiting for her. Before she could speak, he took a step forward, his shadow stretching long across the pavement. "You shouldn't have let me leave," he repeated, his voice steady and cold now. "It was your mistake." Kara's heart raced as she backed away, but Luke's presence felt suffocating. Her breath quickened as she turned to run, but it was too late. Her vision blurred as everything around her darkened, the city's lights flickering as if struggling to stay on. When she finally made it back to her apartment, she rushed inside, slamming the door behind her. Her heart pounded in her chest, her thoughts spiraling as she bolted every lock. The apartment was still. Too still. Then, a whisper broke the silence. It wasn't her mind playing tricks. It came from somewhere deep within her walls, a voice so familiar it made her blood run cold. "You shouldn't have let me leave." Kara's breath hitched. She turned toward the source of the voice, her body frozen in terror. The voice wasn't just Luke's, it was her own, echoing back at her from the dark corners of her apartment. The door to the bedroom creaked open on its own, and she felt the cold air rush past her. She wasn't alone. The whispers grew louder, surrounding her, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to twist and move. Kara tried to scream, but her voice was gone. The last thing she heard was the chilling sound of Luke's voice, a whisper in the dark. "You shouldn't have let me leave." Lena had always been cautious when it came to men, but after a long week of stressful work, she couldn't resist the temptation of a little excitement. She met Mark at the bar, and his easy charm and mischievous smile made her feel like she was young again, carefree. They had a few drinks, talked about everything and nothing, and by the end of the night, she was ready for something more. They walked back to her apartment together, her mind buzzing from the alcohol and the chemistry between them. She barely remembered locking the door behind them before they tumbled into her bedroom, the night quickly turning into a blur of passion and fleeting touches. When Lena woke up the next morning, the bed was empty. The sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows across the room. She sat up, groggy and confused, and glanced at the clock. Late. "Mark?" she called, rubbing her eyes, but there was no answer. She felt a flicker of unease, but she brushed it off. Maybe he just slipped out early. It wasn't the first time a one-night stand had ended with an early exit. She stumbled into the kitchen to make some coffee, trying to shake the weird feeling that lingered in her chest. As she poured the coffee, her phone buzzed. It was a text from Mark. "Last night was great. You were incredible. I'll be back soon. Wait for me." Lena frowned, her fingers freezing midair. "Back soon?" she murmured. She swiped the text open again to read it, but the message was gone. It vanished as if it had never existed. A chill swept over her. She checked the number, nothing. No name, no profile picture. The message had simply disappeared. Confused, she stood there for a moment, before hearing a soft creak. The floorboards behind her groaned as though someone were walking through the apartment. She spun around, expecting to see Mark standing there, but there was no one. "Mark?" she called out, her voice trembling now. Silence. Her heart hammered in her chest as she checked every room of the apartment. The bathroom. The living room. The closets. Nothing. There was no sign of him. She went back to the bedroom, convinced she was imagining things. But then she saw it. The sheets were disturbed, and there was a faint, odd smell in the air. It wasn't the usual scent of perfume or cologne, but something earthy. A little off. Her throat tightened as she approached the bed, looking closely at the pillow where Mark had been sleeping. There, in the fabric, was a small, dark stain. It looked like a handprint, smeared, as if someone had pressed their hand against it in a rush. Her breath caught in her throat as she backed away from the bed. Something was wrong. Very wrong. That's when she heard it again, soft footsteps, slowly approaching from behind. But this time, it wasn't the creak of the floorboards. It was a dragging sound, like fabric or feet scraping along the carpet. "Who's there?" Lena shouted, her voice sharp with fear. But no answer came. Instead, a figure emerged from the shadows, standing motionless in the doorway. It was Mark, only, it wasn't Mark anymore. His eyes were wide and glassy, his skin pale and stretched thin over his bones. He was unrecognizable, the man she had shared the night with, now nothing more than a hollow version of himself. "You shouldn't have let me stay," he whispered, his voice like a rasp, as though he hadn't spoken in years. "You should have sent me away." Lena screamed, but it was swallowed by the thick, heavy silence of the room. The figure stepped forward, its face contorting into a grotesque smile, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too jagged. "You let me in," it hissed, voice distorted, "and now you'll never be rid of me." Lena bolted for the door, her heart pounding in her chest, but the figure was fast, far too fast. It lunged, grabbing her wrist, its cold fingers tightening like a vice. She fought, struggling to break free, but the thing that had once been Mark was relentless. With one final, forceful pull, it dragged her back into the room, where the door slammed shut with an unnatural thud. Outside, the city carried on, unaware that another soul had been claimed. Maya was always cautious about the people she brought home, but that night she was feeling adventurous. She met Sam at a late-night cafe, and there was something about him, his quiet demeanor, the way his eyes seemed to study her with an intensity that made her feel both intrigued and uneasy. But the chemistry was undeniable. They spent hours talking, and by the end of the evening, she invited him back to her apartment. The night started off slow and tender, the soft hum of the city outside her window mingling with the occasional laugh. But as the night wore on, something shifted. The atmosphere grew heavier, and Maya noticed Sam's smile was no longer warm but strange, almost too wide. His touch felt different, too, like it was pressing into her skin in a way that didn't feel right. By morning, he was gone. No note. No sign. Just the lingering feeling of something not quite adding up. She chalked it up to the alcohol, shaking off the nagging feeling as she went about her day. But that night, when she stood in front of her bathroom mirror to wash her face, she froze. There, in the reflection behind her, was Sam. His smile stretched impossibly wide, his eyes dark and void of life. His image was blurry, like a shadow, but his presence was unmistakable. Maya spun around, heart racing, but the room was empty. She looked back at the mirror, nothing had changed. Her breath came in shallow gasps. "Get a grip, Maya," she whispered, wiping the back of her neck with a towel. But when she glanced back at the mirror, there it was again, the reflection of Sam, still standing behind her, watching her with that unholy grin. "Sam," she whispered hoarsely, her voice cracking. The reflection tilted its head, as if amused by her confusion. "You shouldn't have let me stay," it said, the voice coming from the mirror, distorted and distant. Her pulse quickened. She backed away slowly, her eyes locked on the reflection. But it wasn't moving with her. It stayed in place, its grin stretching wider, almost to the point of ripping its face apart. Maya turned and bolted from the bathroom, her footsteps echoing in the silence of the apartment. She rushed to the front door, but when she tried to open it, the knob wouldn't turn. She tugged and pulled, but it was as if the door was glued shut. Behind her, the voice came again, soft at first, then growing louder. "You invited me in. Now, you'll never be alone again." With a panicked scream, Maya rushed to the nearest window and tried to open it. But as her hands grasped the handle, she saw it, the reflection of Sam, now in the window, staring back at her with those same soulless eyes. His smile was impossibly wide, his face beginning to crack and distort like a mask being pulled too tight. She backed away in horror, her heart pounding in her ears. It was no use. No matter where she turned, Sam's reflection followed, an uninvited guest in every mirror, every surface, every glass. In her desperation, Maya grabbed a chair and hurled it through the window. Glass shattered, and the night air rushed in. But when she looked down, there was no sign of escape. Instead, in the reflection of the broken glass, Sam stood, still smiling, his eyes hollow and waiting. "You'll never leave," he whispered, the reflection stretching farther, his face closing in around her. And just like that, Maya understood. It was never about the night. It was never about the drinks or the spark. She had invited something far darker into her life, and now there was no escape. She was trapped, in the glass, in the reflection, in his smile. And Sam would always be there, watching her, waiting. Love these stories? YouTube algorithm suggests that you would like to listen to these stories. Click on the video on the screen.